hour volatility is an area that deeply affects the quality of life and is still not getting the attention it deserves. A couple of days ago, I was listening to a radio report on the increase in union organizing in the South, outside of the big three US manufacturers. And I was very curious that they chose to begin the discussion by interviewing a worker who was talking about how challenging it was for her to be there to pick up her children from school, to schedule doctor's appointments, to basically have any kind of a schedule, because she was constantly dealing with changing hours and was being given her schedule very late. And this was one of her main reasons for even being interested in a union. So, it's of course worse than just picking up your children from school. Unstable work hours and schedules are associated with unpredictable incomes, with household consumption, which is highly sensitive to income variations among low-income workers. It can make it difficult to qualify for benefits like food stamps. So it's really affecting the quality of life for workers in many, many ways. And it's not an issue that I think we paid nearly enough attention to. Given what a strong effect it has on people's lives, it's unsurprising that many people would trade higher incomes for more stable incomes. And, this is one of the issues we're going to discuss today. We have a panel that's in a particularly good position to address these issues. Daniel Schneider's early work in this area and his development of the SHIFT project, which is now based at Harvard, have been critical in bringing attention to the issue. And both Peter and Julie have interesting new insights to share with us today based on their research. Julie's latest paper is up on the INET website. If you go to the chat, you can find a link there, and we'll put it up again in a bit. So if you can take a look at that, and maybe Peter will tell us about his new research. And before we start, let me just take a minute to lay out the structure of the webinar. After I formally introduce our speakers, we're going to have each of them speak for about 10 minutes. And then we will have a conversation for about 10 to 15 minutes with the speakers on some of the policy implications of their work. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, which you can use to submit your questions. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. So Daniel Schneider is the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and professor in the Department of Sociology. Professor Schneider's research focuses on precarious work, social demography, and inequality. As co-director of the SHIFT project, he has co-led the creation of a novel dataset tracking the working experiences of service sector workers. His work examines racial, ethnic, and gender inequalities in job quality, the effects of precarious work on the economic security and well-being of workers and their families, and the effects of labor standards on working conditions. Professor Schneider holds a PhD in sociology and social policy from Princeton University and a BA from Brown University. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, he was a faculty member in the sociology department at the University of California at Berkeley. Julie Kai is an economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, where she works on a variety of issues relating to labor market conditions, racial and gender disparities, economic well-being, and social policy. Her recent work examines the US safety net's buffering effects in the context of job work hour instability. Kai earned her PhD in social welfare with a minor in public affairs from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is an external affiliate with the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy, and was previously a visiting fellow at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Her research interests include household income volatility, job quality, economic inequality, and poverty. Peter Ganong is an associate professor of public policy at UChicago Harris School of Public Policy. He's an economist who studies the effect of public policies on people facing difficult financial circumstances. In his research on the foreclosure crisis, he found that most borrowers defaulted due to insufficient liquidity, and that many foreclosures could have been averted through liquidity-focused modifications to mortgages. He has found that unemployment benefits play a crucial role in sustaining the consumption of unemployed workers. In ongoing work, he is studying the effects of racial wealth inequality and the effects of high liquidity on the US economy. Ganong is a faculty research fellow at the NBER. He received a BA and PhD in economics from Harvard and has spent 2 years in public service, one at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and one at the City of Boston's Citywide Analytics team. He was a visiting assistant professor at MIT during the fall of 2021. With that, let me turn it over to Daniel to kick us off.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Pia, and thanks to colleagues at CEPR and INET for putting on this panel. It's great to be with Julie and Peter today, and with all of you. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm going to talk today about the SHIFT project and our work on work schedule instability and unpredictability and the very real implications that it has for household economic security. As this group well knows, by many measures, work has become far more precarious over the past 50 years, that driven by the forces of deunionization, deregulation, globalization, and putting on my Berkeley hat for a minute, neoliberalism, work in America has really transformed. And workers, especially those in the low-wage service sector in the United States, the workers in fast food and big box stores, in delivery and fulfillment, in retail apparel and pharmacy, contend not just with low wages, not just with limited benefits, and not just with non-standard schedules, but increasingly with an organization of work time that is unstable and unpredictable. Hourly workers in these sectors, hourly workers at some of the largest and most profitable firms in the country, often have schedules that change from day to day and week to week, often with little advance notice of what their schedules will be, and a great deal of variability in how many hours they will be scheduled to work. Workers have seized on this issue over the last, I'd say, 15 years, and through organizing and calls to action have pressed for new labor standards, a reimagination in some sense of our basic approach to fair hours regulation, to bring the FLSA in many ways up to the current moment and to regulate amount of advance notice, unstable and unpredictable hours, last minute cancellations, and the like. These coalitions of workers, very much in keeping with the recent upsurge in union activity that Pia mentioned at the beginning, have also pressed companies directly to take action to stabilize work schedules and to make hours and shifts more predictable. These are urgent demands by workers, and yet for quite a while, we lacked sufficient data to really understand the scope of this issue, its consequences for workers' economic security, health, and well-being, and the capacity of local labor standards to move the needle on these practices. And so when my colleague Kristen and I entered this space, an area of research I want to point out that was really sort of spearheaded by Susan Lambert, whose name I was delighted to see in the participant list. Hi, Susan. We really sought a way to try to build out what we saw as additional missing data at the time. We wanted data that would help us do a few things. First, we wanted to capture really detailed measures of workers' experiences with work scheduling, as well as other aspects of job quality, the kind of dark matter of job quality that we often fail to observe with our standard instruments, which are really tuned to seeing wages and hours and maybe health insurance. And we wanted to be able to monitor change in these practices over time. We also wanted to be able to look within firms. Workers were calling out Walmart and Starbucks and other firms for their practices. We wanted to know what was going on in those firms and if those firms really were going to change in response to this public outcry. And then finally, we wanted the kind of data that would let us see if local labor standards were having the effects that they anticipated on work schedules and work hours. And to build that, we developed what now exists under the mantle of the SHIFT project, which was a novel way of trying to reach hourly service sector workers at these large service sector firms and ask them all about their jobs, especially their schedules, as well as their economic and social well-being. And so to do that, what we did was arrive at a novel, unusual data collection strategy, which was essentially to observe that we could both sample and recruit hourly workers at specific firms by using paid advertisements on social media. In essence, Meta's advertising platform became our sampling frame, and their paid ads became our recruitment device. And using this approach of delivering ads to workers at specific firms, we have built a large data set that covers workers at about 145 of the largest service sector firms in the country, the McDonald's and Starbucks and Walmarts and Whole Foods and UPSs of the world. We have collected this data now across, well, it's not on here, but across 15 repeated cross sections of data collection from these workers at large firms in the US since the fall of 2016. I'm going to mostly talk about the data that we get from the yellow boxes, what we call our national sample, but these data also include strategic oversamples of workers in places that have passed secure scheduling laws, as well as short-run panels in which we follow up longitudinally with workers who are sampled in the cross sections. Together, this data has created information from more than 150,000 hourly workers across these large firms and across this variety of subsectors, but all within the broader service sector. What do we learn from these data about work scheduling practices? Well, I guess the first thing I want to say is we don't just learn about work scheduling practices. While that's high on our list, over time, the survey has broadened to try to capture really multiple dimensions of job quality as experienced in the service sector. So schedules and wages, but also access to paid sick leave, COVID safety precautions, surveillance and automation, paid family leave, and even more subjective experiences of respect and harassment on the job. So let's focus on schedules, because I think there is where we see, in some sense, the fundamental determinants of some forms of income instability in the social organization of work, and particularly of low-wage work in the service sector. First, we ask workers, hey, how far in advance do you know your work schedule? As a faculty member, I can say that I know my work schedule, at least in terms of my class schedule, I don't know, something like 6 to 12 months in advance. This is not the way in the service sector. Instead, what we see is that only about a third of workers get their schedules at least 2 weeks in advance of when they'll work. Another third get 1 to 2 weeks notice. Almost a quarter of workers are getting less than 72 hours notice, and large shares are getting between 3 and 6 days advance notice of their schedules. Short notice is endemic. But even once schedules are published, they are subject to change. But that power to edit really lies in the hands of the manager, where we find that almost 2/3 of workers report some kind of last-minute timing change in their schedule, like being sent home early or asked to stay late. And large shares of workers also report canceled shifts or working on-call shifts. In these practices, we see what Susan has really described as an effort to align labor with business demand, and in this sense, shift the risk of unpredictable customer demand onto workers themselves and away from firms' bottom lines. A lot of our work has been to show the consequences of exposure to this kind of instability for workers and their families. And so here I'm showing some data from a paper we published a few years ago, looking at the association between exposure to schedule instability and material hardships. And what we see first is that material hardship is high among hourly service sector workers, according to these survey-based estimates, but it is significantly higher among those workers who are exposed to the most forms of schedule instability and unpredictability. This is also true then for the kinds of financial products that workers who are subject to uncertain and unpredictable hours at generally low wages must often turn to. We see a pretty strong relationship, for instance, with schedule instability and the use of pawn shops, or of being assessed overdraft fees on bank accounts, or having adverse credit card debt. These practices also have consequences for health and well-being. This slide shows not just the association of work schedule instability with adult sleep quality. Workers who have more unstable schedules in study after study are shown to have lower sleep quality, but it sizes it against 2 well-known hazards to poor sleep. The first is working a night shift, which we know disrupts circadian rhythms, and the second is having a small child, which probably resonates with many of us on the call, or you can cast back to that memory. And what we see, which sort of blew my mind, because I remember having a child 0 to 4 years of age, was that having an unstable schedule is kind of like that, but all the time, and not necessarily an experience that your job ages out of, unfortunately. These practices are persistent. We have seen the continued use of short shift timing changes of less than 2 weeks notice, really across the pre, during, and now late pandemic periods in the labor market. Do I have another minute? I'll take another minute. So the one thing I want to point out here is that this is, sorry?
You have enough time. Go ahead.
I'll keep going for another minute or two. It's tempting to see this as inevitable, that there must be a race to the bottom in the low-wage service sector such that firms must adopt these just-in-time practices, that if this is the way to keep labor budgets under control in tight margin industries, then shouldn't we see broad adoption of these practices? And part of what we've tried to do with the SHIFT project is to test that assumption. Because what we've seen more and more in recent research is that labor markets don't always perform the way that we think they might from our model-based understandings in the contemporary institutional environment. What we see is that there is tremendous variation between firms in the service sector and how their workers fare. This chart is showing us variation between firms in workers' experiences of material hardship and showing us the variation between, say, a Taco Bell, where almost a third of workers report going hungry because they couldn't afford enough to eat, against Trader Joe's, where that share, while not zero, is far lower. Now, certainly some of this variation is driven by wages, and we do see tremendous variation in the levels and trend in and dispersion of hourly wages across these firms, from your Costco's on the far left-hand side to your Dollar Generals on the right. But we also see a huge amount of variation across these firms in work scheduling practices, where over half of workers, for instance, at a dollar stores report on-call shifts against a significantly lower share, under 5%, at firms like Trader Joe's or Apple. Is this to say that we can count then on firms to take the high road? No. This is clear evidence that we can't count on firms to do that voluntarily, or not all firms. Instead, and as I hope we'll talk about more in the Q&A, what this provides is an existence proof that there is another way to conduct work scheduling practices, a way that we think leads to less volatility and instability in workers' pocketbooks and lives, by raising the floor and enacting updated labor standards that speak to this important workplace experience. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Peter, let me hand it over to you.
Can everyone hear me okay? I'm gonna try this. How does this look? Okay. Oh, I just lost my video of you. All right, I now have video. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. This is a group of researchers and policy folks that I really don't know as well. And so I'm really excited to hear your questions and more about what's on your mind. I'm going to talk about a new project which I've been working on sorry, I'm trying to get my timer set. I'm failing. With several co-authors at UChicago about the anatomy of monthly earnings volatility. Danny had about 20 slides, and it was a sole authored slide deck. And I have 10 slides, or maybe 9, and there's 5 authors. So my productivity rate is about 1/10 the productivity of Danny's. But nonetheless, I'm excited to tell you a little bit about our what we're finding about monthly earnings volatility. So the research question that we're interested in is a similar but not identical question to the one that Danny talked about, which is, does stable employment imply stable earnings? So in any given pay period, a worker's earnings will depend on, if they're an hourly worker, the combination of wages and hours. And we know from prior research that base wages are relatively stable, but the worker's volatility of earnings from pay period to pay period or month to month is much more difficult to measure. Why is it difficult to measure? Well, the primary ways that we've had of learning about income volatility so far, one has been annual administrative data. So here I have in mind particularly tax records, although also the census is relevant for this. And when you see someone's earnings bouncing around in tax records, it is a mix of unstable employment and within job volatility. And these records are very good for teaching us about permanent income risk, but they're not as good for teaching us about transitory income volatility. And then we have surveys, but when we do surveys, you often, you can survey people once, but then you don't necessarily have their firm side records, although in some cases, like in particular, Susan, who's on the call, has gotten firm side records, but it's more difficult from the survey side to get firm side records. And so the key finding in our paper is going to be, and there's no paper yet, ongoing research, is that stable employment relationships do not guarantee stable earnings. The way that we're going to learn about this is using micro data from a company that serves as a payroll processor. So this is, in some sense, much more systematic than just serving a few firms, but it's also a different segment of the economy because it's just teaching us about small businesses. So this is a company that does payroll processing for small businesses. They run payroll for 5 to 10 million employees per month in the US, and we have data for about 500,000 firms. And we're going to see paycheck level earnings and hours. And we've done a lot of work, which I'm not going to go into depth on now, which compares what does the hourly wage distribution look like in a representative data set as compared to in this convenience data set from this one payroll processor. What does the hours work distribution look like? What does the pay frequency distribution look like? On all of the metrics that we found so far, we found that payroll company data are quite similar to those broader US benchmarks. So now I'm just going to dive in and tell you about payroll company and sort of have you take it as a stand-in for people working at small businesses in the US. So I'm going to show you 4 facts. The first is I'm going to show you that hours, ooh, that's a big typo. Hours are much more volatile than wages. So to measure wage and hours volatility, we're going to construct monthly average pay per paycheck. This is going to abstract from the fact that many workers have some months with 2 paychecks, some months with 3 paychecks. That is another source of pay volatility, but we want to abstract from it from now. And we're just going to ask, take the log of pay per paycheck this month, take the log of pay per paycheck last month, and look at the difference. And first, what I want to show you is the sort of well-known fact, which is that most workers have wages that are stable from month to month. So 90% of workers have wages that are stable, 10% of workers have wage changes each month, mostly to the upside, as to be expected. This is the thing that I think was easy to know based on other existing data sets. The new thing is when we look at earnings changes, and here I'm showing you for hourly workers because we only base wages defined for hourly workers. And workers' hours, as best as I can tell, are all over the place. So 83% of workers don't have the same work hours per paycheck as they did at the last pay period. The median change is 6%, and the 75th percentile of change is 18%. So that is to say, 75% of workers at small businesses are having hours changes of at least 18% from one month to the next. And then if you compute a standard deviation, you get 33%. And hours are the whole ballgame. So if you look at total earnings, sort of mechanically based on the other things I told you, all of the earnings volatility that we see for hourly workers is coming from the hours, not from the earnings. I think that's kind of obvious once you know the hours volatility. Our second fact is that earnings are actually also volatile for salary workers, although in a slightly different way. So I'm showing you in red the same earnings for hourly workers I showed you before, and now I'm going to add earnings for salaried workers in blue, and they're still quite volatile. So about 40% of salaried workers have some change in pay relative to the prior month. Their median change is 0, but there's still volatility. And then in work that I'm not going to have time to get into right now, it's mostly volatility the upside. So salary workers mostly get pay and then have a bunch of extra up stuff sometimes. So it's different than the hourly workers for whom they're getting both ups and downs. Fact 3, most income risk is not recurring annual payments. So one natural question is, well, how much of this pay volatility that we see is seasonal? You know, there's lots of features of the US economy that are seasonal, lots of features of our lives are seasonal. And so you might be interested in, to what extent is income risk seasonal? And the answer that we have to date is, it appears to be very little. So we're going to define recurring seasonal income volatility as your income today, as we try to predict it using a 12-month lag. This is going to include if your pay goes down or to 0 in the summer, if you get a regular bonus, if you get a recurring annual raise. And this predicts a decent chunk, although less than half of volatility for the salaried workers. And it predicts basically none of volatility for the hourly workers. And this isn't for lack of trying different models. So we've spent, I don't know, at this point, a month or two trying a lot of different statistical models because we thought that volatility might have been more predictable, especially for hourly workers. And thus far, we are failing to predict volatility very well for hourly workers. We don't know what the workers know. We don't know what the workers and managers say to each other, but statistics are not a very good tool for predicting what's going to happen to hourly workers. Finally, and this is going to connect now to some of the stuff that Danny was saying about different labor practices, higher firm pay volatility predicts higher quit rates. So I'm going to use a slightly different measure of volatility, and since I have 3 minutes left, I'm not going to get into details. But down here on the left side is low volatility firms. These are firms that either have their workers work a consistent number of hours or have salaried employees. And so the median pay change at those firms is 0. They have a quit rate of 0.5% per month. So that means that 1 in 200 workers leave those firms each month. If you go to the high volatility workers, and I guess I'd be interested to know more about what this looks like for like the big retail firms that shift this sampling. If you go to the high volatility workers, the firms that are high volatility, there's about a 2% quit rate per month. So 2% of workers are quitting each month. And this is something something specific to quits. So the firing rate across these different firms is low and quite similar. And the layoff rate is also pretty similar between high and low volatility firms. So it's not just the case that firms are dialing up and down their labor demand across a variety of dimensions. It specifically seems to be that workers are walking out the door when pay is volatile in a way that they're not getting laid off more when pay is volatile. And so I think this sort of tells us something about how workers feel about it. If this relationship is causal, and I'm showing you a cross-sectional regression, so there's lots of reasons why it might not be causal, but if it is causal, it's telling you something about how workers feel about pay volatility, and that workers are on average voting with their feet to avoid firms that have volatile pay. We've also done this at the individual level instead of at the worker level, and you get very similar results. So workers who have more volatile pay are more likely to quit. So we don't yet have a claim to causality here, but we're interested in causality, and what we've seen so far makes it look like firms that have volatile pay are also going to have high turnover because of workers quitting. So to wrap up, I've started working with several co-authors on a simple question. How big is monthly income volatility within the bounds of an employment relationship? And we have at this point 4 new facts. So many employment relationships do not provide stable income from month to month. Hours fluctuations are a big source of earnings instability. Most monthly income risk is not recurring annual payments, and quits are higher at firms with volatile pay. And at least from the perspective of the narrow perspective of this research project, I think there are a number of open questions, which I hope we can sort of talk about in the Q&A and in the chat. Some of them are, how much is volatility workers choosing volatile hours, which I think is a job amenity. My hours are volatile and I'm very happy about that, versus firms choosing volatile hours, which I think would be a disamenity. Another question is, how much of workers' preferences for jobs without volatility, so this is leaning into that quits fact, is because the schedule volatility is a disamenity. So here I think about things like the stress and the sleep piece that Danny talked about, versus other aspects of salaried jobs, like more financial stability was another piece Danny talked about, or better benefits. So right now, I think they're sort of all lumped together in this quits regression, but ideally, I'm sort of interested to think about how to separate all the different ways in which, and think about which these jobs differ. And then a final question that I have is, why do firms offer volatile hours? And Danny touched on this a little bit in the context of sort of talking about capitalism, but I would ask, how much is this the nature of production versus management practices? And I don't know, but again, I'm interested. I'm like particularly excited to be talking to sort of a community of people who I don't feel like I don't know that well. And so both in the chat and in Q&A, and then also afterward, like I'd really love to hear from you. I put my email address here just so you don't even have to Google it. But I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you today and afterward. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Let me hand it over to Julie now. Julie, you're still on mute.
Okay, sorry for the delay. And thank you so much for organizing this, Inet, and for sponsoring this talk. And of course, to our crews here at CIPA for putting all this together. And I saw a lot of experts whose work that I really admire. And as a new person to this space, I'm gonna present some of the work that builds on previous work in this space. So the benefit of going like this is that I don't have to put too much background talk here. As Danny and Peter has mentioned, where our instability has a lot of consequences for people's life, both work and non-work. And in this talk, I'm gonna focus on how that impact financial well-being of workers. And this is a very quick graph that shows us the two sectors that saw the most job growth in the past 20 decades or so, 30 decades, which are healthcare, service, and leisure and hospitality, such as hotels, restaurants, and services. And they account for a large share of the growth in the US employment between 1990 and the most recent year, 2022. Although we don't have a final breakdown here for the education and health services, but we know like majority of those workers with jobs such as healthcare, home healthcare aides or childcare workers or teaching assistants, right? We don't want to confuse that with the professional services because the professional services of physicians, doctors are somewhere down here. And what does all this have to do with volatility we are talking about today? Because many of those jobs are low wage or low pay and are held by women, particularly female workers of color. And a number of scholars have documented this low wage job as precarious job from a multi-dimensional perspective. So in this paper, I try to answer two questions: whether the volatility would link to a worker's subsequent earnings, if it's a positive relationship or negative relationship, and how that association vary by occupation, gender, and race. And I used the current population survey to answer these questions. As many of you know, the CPS has a subsample of workers who are followed for 4 continuous months. And we used the panel design of that feature to capture a group of hourly workers that are nationally represented month to month to see how their hours instability linked to their subsequent earnings at the 4th month. Although there's a unique identifier, because some people might drop out of the survey, so we use race and sex variables to further verify a same individual is followed across that 4-month window. And to be clear, this is our wage workers, as Danny mentioned, because they are most vulnerable to that unpredictable scheduling issues. And in order to kind of capture the involuntary part, the involuntary feature of that instability, we try to exclude workers who do not miss work or work part-time for the following reasons, such as taking leave, attending school, going back to school, or taking parental leave, because there are more, options by choice, so that we could really capture whether that's employer-driven instability. So the outcomes here we are looking at is the earned income at the 4th month of our workers. And the key predictor is instability that's calculated using the first 4 months data to kind of compute a volatility index. And I try to understand the high volatility and how that impact a worker's financial well-being. So I use the tercile of the instability distribution to capture high volatility, because sometimes they could be ups and down and the magnitude may matter a lot for the earnings. And further, I decompose that into different occupations, but mainly looking at healthcare support roles, food preparation, serving, and other care service jobs such as childcare workers and K-12 teaching assistant, as I mentioned. And of course, like in the retail stores, those are categorized as sales and related jobs. And last but not least, I decompose that to manufacturing or production related job, but those are mainly serve as a comparison. Then 8 different demographic groups are created to try to understand the intersection of race and sex. Then I control for a bunch of covariate to try to understand how, after controlling for that, if there's still a relationship between unpredictable instability and a worker's earnings. Okay, so descriptively, this is what we got in the national sample. So 2 out of 3 hourly workers had some sort of month-to-month hour volatility. And I would say this is consistent with what Danny and Joe shows before in a previous paper, where they show about 33% of workers do not have any sort of instability. It's like exactly identical. And among those having any sort of volatility, about 36% have at least a shock. So how do we define a shock as an hour change from a month to the next by at least 20%? Reduction, that's only down only by 20% or more reduction. And here's still a descriptive result, but this is plotting earned income trend and the volatility trend over time. So the dashed line here is the instability trend. And we see that 2 lines are actually heading in 2 different directions. And this is what I may expect, because I anticipate there might be a negative relationship between the 2. And we see like there's a deception, which is in the pandemic year, because those 2 lines are heading in the same direction. And I suspect that there might be some compositional effects happening during that time. And we will see that in a minute when decomposing it into different type of jobs. Okay, so this breaks it down according to a worker's race or ethnicity. And let's look at the line in on the first panel is volatilities, and in the second panel is earned income by race and ethnicity. So overall, we see during the pandemic period, more of a jump for worker of colors, and most notable among Hispanic and API people. But on the right-hand side, when you see the wages, which already high among white and API workers, they grew for all groups as well, like over time, but relatively slowly among Hispanic workers in recent 2 years. And I think one thing that worth highlighting here is that in general, during economic expansions after the recession, non-white workers often benefit more in terms of wage growth, but it took a long time for them to get there. Then a recession may hit. So now we are seeing the patterns of volatility and earnings broken down by major occupation categories. So our group of workers here had wage increase in the period before the COVID pandemic. And this continued through the pandemic as most of the workers were kind of often essential to meeting basic needs. So, they might be in the care and service jobs, but the pattern of earning and volatility were generally similar. They're heading into different directions, except for manufacturing and production jobs. So, like I said, they are mainly serving for comparison. But I'm gonna talk about that in a minute in the regression context. So I went ahead to estimate some regressions for job stayers, or we say who share the same employment spells, or job switchers separately. And I let volatility level interact with occupation. And then the next set of models, I substitute that occupation with race or ethnicity and gender to kind of understand the intersection of race and race and sex. And this is how I got. In a nutshell, what I found is that earning differences of instability did vary by workers' occupation and race and gender, but this is only true when they were in the same employment spell. So in a visual sense, this is what we get. So let's look at some detail here. The comparison group from this regression is hourly workers in non-service, non-care jobs with no volatility. And each bar tells us that the earning differences for each group by volatility levels relative to their comparison group. And the panel on your right-hand side is for those having high volatile work schedules. And specifically for worker in non-care, non-occupation, as this blue bar show, have high instability is associated with about 9% reduction in earnings. They are all in non-care and non-service occupation, but with high volatility, a worker may experience 9% reduction in earnings. And those in other occupation like sales, retail care, services, shop, that instability was associated with higher earning penalty, as what we see in the last 4 bars here. And at this point, you might wonder why we don't see the manufacturing or production related jobs. And I was surprised at the first place, but later on I realized, okay, yeah, it's actually right here is 0. So the penalty for them is much smaller, nearly 0. And they are all significant. So that means even volatility works against them, but they do not experience any earning penalty because manufacturing job is still relatively a high pay occupation. And last but not least, when I broke it down to race and gender, this is what we see for white male workers as the comparison group when they don't have any instability. So high instability in work hours related to about 6% earning reduction, as the blue bar here shows on your right-hand side. So for female workers, regardless of their race and ethnicity, women workers all experience a much higher earning penalty when they have that same level of volatility relative to their male counterparts. That's the main story here. So just to sum up, what I found is that workers of color usually realize higher earning or benefit more in terms of their wage growth after the Great Recession or pandemic recession, but it took a long time for them to get there. And net of other characteristics, there's a negative relationship between unpredictable work schedules and earnings. But this is mostly driven by those low-wage jobs. And if we look at those workers who stay in the same job, workers of colors, especially female workers, earn substantially less than their male counterparts when having high instability. And I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all. There were some very interesting ideas there, and Daniel, thanks to your data, we can push a little bit maybe on how we can start thinking about some of the policy issues here. But I wonder if I could start with sort of a more general question. I should say all 3 of you should feel free to jump in and have a conversation with each other as we do this. But Peter, I was just wondering, given your research looking at salaried workers, if we look at this over a sort of longer term, have we seen a change in what's happening? Maybe we don't even have the data to answer this question yet, since some of the data collection seems fairly recent. But if I think of the work that David Weil, for example, is doing out of Brandeis, where he's talking about a fissured economy and how we have fissured employment within corporations, or the work that Bill Lazonick is doing, where he's talking about how the nature of the American corporation has changed, so that people used to start with one company and stay with the same company for most of their careers, enabling their income to grow. And that's been changing drastically over the last 2 or 3 decades. How much do you think this kind of volatility that we're seeing can be linked to the fundamental change in the nature of the American corporation and employment within America?
I'm gonna give not unpopular, an opposite answer to what Danny said in his initial voiceover, but the best data that I'm aware of on income volatility over time comes from the Social Security Administration records. And there's a long-term working paper that I hope will be eventually published, but looks great to me in terms of methodology by Jay Song, Nick Bloom, and several other co-authors. And basically the advantage of this is the tax records are better than the PSID, and they have SSA records going back really far in time. And in their analysis, income volatility is going down over time, not going up over time. So I know that there's some PSID analyses which have shown that income volatility is going up. I also know from having worked with the PSID that it can be really hard to know how to clean the data in that context. But for the best data we have, it looks like income volatility is going down. So that's what it is. In some sense, like the idea that like the question of what has newly changed or what has newly fallen apart, I'm not sure. But in the aggregate, income volatility at the annual level is lower than it was before, based on the Bloom and Song paper. I'll put that in the chat in a moment.
Danny, thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We have pretty limited data on the scheduling side in terms of change over time. Julie has a nice time series here, and in the paper she mentioned that I have with Joe Labriola at Michigan, we use some similar data from the CPS to look at actual hours worked in the last week and look at hours volatility, and our count, it's really have changed since the Great Recession as well. Susan and others have sort of done, almost like qualitative work. I don't know that it's based on interviews with key actors, and Peter Fugel is doing some of this work now. And there's really an account that on the scheduling side, things did change because in some sense of a change in technology, that large workforce management firms rolled out new approaches to scheduling and actively marketed these products as allowing for this kind of just-in-time scheduling that now sort of predominates, or has, for the last decade or so predominated in the scheduling world. Is the use of those practices, shaped by these aspects around the broader organization of work, a fissuring of the workplace, as David says, around the growing financialization of firms, or a shift towards shareholder value, like Neil Fligstein and Greta Krippner and others have argued in the sort of political economy, economic sociology space? I don't think we have great data to know. But one thing that David Weil and I are looking at now is whether we see variation in these scheduling practices by one particular form of fissuring, franchising. So do we see that workers at franchised establishments in the fast food space, which is where this is really predominant, are more exposed to this kind of schedule instability and unpredictability? And we might well think they would be, because as we know from work by folks like Brian Calici and others, is franchisees are under enormous financial pressure by the terms of their franchise agreements, right? They are being squeezed by franchisors, and they in turn, we might expect, are squeezing workers. And so that is exactly a nice example of that kind of fissured relationship that might generate, through that particular mechanism, these kinds of unstable and unpredictable experiences.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Adding to that,
Go ahead, Julie.
really quick. So yeah, I would say income instability, definitely not really trending up, but it's not also like going down if we look at months to months, but it depends on the timing or the duration we measure. But I sort of agree with Peter, on aggregate or on average, it's not going up. I mean, at least that's something that we saw from the shed as well, because they
I guess
asked.
one just tiny thing is like, I don't care a lot if it's going up or going down insofar as like it's high, and so it seems like a worthy of our attention and time and policy interest, and so like the trends don't seem, you know, I guess if there's a new trend, then maybe we want to like nip it in the bud, but it looks to me like this is like fairly perennial regardless of
Yeah, but
trending up or
then,
down.
you know, we would want to see in the longer term, it could trend down. I mean, that's what we hope for. But in terms of the hours trend, I would say from what I see from the CPS, it's kind of level up at this point, but certain groups still experience elevated level of instability. And unlike wages, I think work hours is still relatively unregulated in private market or in the private firms. So we do need that type of universal policy to handle that issue.
Yeah, the reason I was actually asking the question is so that we can shift into the policy conversation a little bit, because to the extent that it's coming from issues like fishing, it does have something to say about how we think about it. But Daniel, you've been doing a fair amount of work on how we think about solutions to this problem at a policy level. Maybe you could introduce us to some of your ideas.
Yeah, this is an exciting area of policymaking. I mean, if we think about the world of labor standards policy at the federal level, we really are oriented around the Fair Labor Standards Act. But what we have seen is at the local and state level, a kind of profusion of progressive federalism, where states and localities have passed higher minimum wage laws, paid family and medical leave laws, paid sick laws, and secure scheduling laws. And these ordinances, which have been passed in cities like San Francisco and Seattle and New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, as well as in the state of Oregon, and with similar diffusion ongoing, seek to regulate this aspect of work schedule instability and unpredictability. I would say that the target is not necessarily income volatility, although that might be a benefit, but rather the set of the target is in some sense providing for jobs that we think are better for workers on benefit workers on multiple dimensions: less earnings volatility, but perhaps also better sleep quality and more humane and respectful working conditions as well. These laws require relatively little of employers in the grand scheme of things, to provide 2 weeks notice of people's work schedules, and then if they change those work schedules within that period, to provide some predictability pay to workers in recompense for that last minute timing changes. We have had some evaluations of these laws. My colleague Kristen and I evaluated Seattle's secure scheduling law, and we find modest increases in the share of workers getting 2 weeks notice. There's been an evaluation of Emeryville, which is a tiny city in the East Bay that passed the law, which finds some benefits for workers, including increased sleep quality. And there's some new work ongoing using firm level data to look at the effects of these laws in Chicago and Philadelphia and LA. The laws, though, are complex, and many employers report that they are difficult to understand and difficult to execute in the compliance. And so there's a tension there between, how to effectively regulate these practices in a way that maximizes compliance in an environment where we know labor law compliance in general is difficult and enforcement agencies are understaffed.
Peter, Julie, anything?
Oh, I just had a quick question, which is, what do we know about, it seems like it would be really useful to know about firms' cost of compliance, because it would affect sort of subsequently how we think about various pieces, and like, seems really challenging, but since I'm newer to this space, I know less about it, but like, do we have any way to measure what are firms' costs of complying with like different provisions?
So it's a little hard to figure out the sort of cost to the firm of these laws, because on the one hand, if we take your estimates, for instance, on turnover seriously, there could be substantial benefits to being pushed scheduling practices. But if your law is so great, why isn't everybody already doing it? Well, maybe because they don't know is one possibility, or the incentives aren't set up for frontline managers to follow these practices. One vision is that the cost of compliance could be fairly low. If it's about a technological implementation of these laws, then couldn't the large human resource management providers like Kronos and Dayforce and Homebase and Deputy devise tools that make compliance simple and straightforward? And the answer is they're working on that, but many firms don't want software that defaults to these stable and predictable scheduling rules, or even necessarily to compliance with these laws. So it's also possible that the costs of compliance vary substantially across different kinds of firms or different sectors. So I think there's a lot more to be figured out there, although I think more and more people are turning their attention to this, where they can find the data to do it.
So adding to that, I would say geographical factor may matter a lot here. And, even though we see a lot of liberal actions happening at the local or state level, but without kind of federal mandate on this, some of the areas, because we know states like Midwest or Southern state, they may have lower level and UI benefits, minimum wage or employment rates seem also low in those states, and the organizing power or workers' bargaining power. Union organizing are also far less common in those places outside Northeast. So we may also think about the spatial distribution of that volatility.
Yeah, someone put into our Q&A that it looks like union jobs have lower wage volatility. One can imagine that this would be one of the positive effects of actually pushing union movement. But
John, is that something that you saw in one of our slides, or is that something, John, that you saw from elsewhere?
Me?
No, so then John Sarah Perry, one of the commenters, said it looks like union jobs have lower wage volatility. I was asking where that was coming from.
John, I've actually enabled you to speak, but maybe you can put it back into the Q&A. Okay. Julia, I wanted to turn to your results on the differences by gender and race for the effects of this volatility, which I actually found super interesting. And I'm curious as to whether you've been able to pin down what's driving those differences. How much of it is differences in occupation, and how much of it do you believe is just coming from straight up discrimination?
Yes, that's a good question, but it's a tough one. I guess because in those models that control for different factors, including state of residence, occupation, or industry, we do see a negative relationship between the unpredictability and their financial outcomes. So, we could say, okay, within the same occupation or industry, and certain group of workers still experience negative consequences of that. So it could be because of their employer's treatment, or I would say, it's all about power or employer power. And that's, require a lot of actions to have a change. And sometimes, if we say, okay, for example, an occupation that we are seeing for production or manufacturing jobs, they all experience volatility, even though it's so-called unpredictability or involuntary change. That's what we capture from the data, but they do not experience any earning reduction or any earning penalties. That's what we saw from the data. So, on one hand, like occupational composition or effect may matter, but on the other hand, employer treatment, in those low wage service job, I think that's one of the biggest factor. Or firm specific context, I guess Danny's data might play a big role here.
Interesting.
To further explain, because like, for example, in the CPS, what I know is that, yeah, even whether someone is changing their job or changing their employment spell, but I have no idea what their direct manager or their specific workplace contact look like. when they switch jobs.
I did see reference to a study that said workers' job quality was worse when they had a direct supervisor of a different race. I feel like it's sort of a difficult area to. Dan, is that your hand up?
Just very briefly, this thing we've looked at in the realm of scheduling and more generally in wages, and it kind of follows a recent current in work in sociology and economics, looking at what degree gaps are attributable to within versus between, within between sector, but also within between firm sorting. And so, using our data, we find that a significant portion of race ethnic gaps in schedule quality are by sorting of workers into different firms within the service sector. So it seems like white workers and particularly are getting sorted into firms that provide everyone with more stable schedules, and women of color in particular are getting sorted to firms that provide lower level schedule stability and predictability. But even more important is this mismatch on manager. Managers have an enormous amount of discretion in setting schedules within firms. We see a lot of between manager variation, and workers of color are just less likely to have a same race manager as white workers. And we see that as actually exerting a significant penalty on schedules there.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to shift to the questions that we have here. If you have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. And let me see, I have one here from Jane Collins, who says, I'm interested in the relationship between schedule and earnings volatility and multiple job holding. It would seem that the earnings instability would make it more necessary to have a side job, while these scheduling practices would make it harder. Did your studies address this at all? I'm going to open it up to all of you. Anyone who wants to jump in?
Peter, is this something you can look at? Can you link workers across firms, or is that?
We're trying, that's why I smiled. You can do this. Until 6 months ago, like pretty much all my research used bank account data. In bank account data, I'm still working with the bank account data, but we also start working with payroll data. In the bank account data, you can see people with multiple jobs. We've computed pay volatility is very similar in the bank account data than as it is in the paycheck data. So it's just sort of like, these are giving us consistent stories. But that doesn't answer your, you're asking deep questions and I'm giving you simple facile measurement answers, like the numbers look the same. And we're definitely interested in thinking about the harder and more interesting questions that you're asking.
Okay. I have a question here from Hillary Weathing. She says, I thought Peter's slide showing higher incidence of quit rates was very thought-provoking. And Danny and Julie, have you looked at the relationship between hours, volatility, and schedule instability in a worker's employment? Put another way, how hard is it for a worker to keep their job if they experience schedule instability?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Nice to hear from you and see you on here. Yeah, I also found Peter's chart super compelling. I really like the way you contrasted these different forms of exit. This thing we've looked at a little in our panel data in the Shift project, looking at how exposure to work schedule instability at time one is associated with exit at follow-up periods, and we find a very similar, different independent variable in a sense, but similar conceptual variable. And we find a similar relationship where a lot of it's driven by quits. And is what's it a quit to is one question. And we find that these are not upward mobility quits. This is not that people are quitting to get better jobs necessarily. It's that they're quitting because they can't sustain this job. We look and see what moderates the relationship between work schedule instability and turnover. And we find that, it's importantly driven by work-life conflict and economic insecurity and just job dissatisfaction. And so, in some sense, I think this is one piece of evidence that this kind of volatility forms a sort of poverty trap, where it is not an effective, it is the opposite of a launching pad to career mobility. It is the opposite of a first rung on the ladder. It's a broken rung, and one that keeps one from rising in many cases.
Yeah, I was gonna mention the paper Danny just talked about, the job turnover. It looks like you have a paper that look at unpredictability and how that impact job turnover. But in the CPS data, given that it's a short panel, so I would not be really able to track how the employment trajectory look like when they change job. But when I did separate the job stayers and job changers, what we are finding is that they might be likely to switch to a better job. And I think that makes sense. I mean, if they if they experience different employment spell, but given it's a very short time frame, and I would not be really able to see how their financial outcome look like in the long term. But for sure, what we find or what we see here is like within a job, those certain group of people may fare worse than the other group of people.
Okay, we have a few people bringing up the issue of unions again. And someone asked, what is the state of research that isolates the impact unions have on minimizing scheduling volatility, separate from state local scheduling laws, given firm level payroll data? Daniel, have you looked at the impact of union shops within firms? And then John Seraper is, Peter, answering your earlier question about
Thank you.
the data. And has another comment on union workers having more job security during the pandemic. So I wonder if any or all of you would like to comment on the issue of unions.
So, one interesting question around unions is that there's a sort of two-sided issue here. So one is, to what extent do unions help regulate work schedules? And I think there's evidence that often scheduling practices are written into collective bargaining agreements and union contracts, and often following a kind of, not surprisingly, seniority-based rule system. The sense is also, honestly, and the late great Dan Clausen, along with Naomi Gerstel, have done some work analyzing union agreements with respect to scheduling. And I think people have pointed out that perhaps not surprisingly, some of the secure scheduling laws read an awful lot like collective bargaining agreements in their specificity and rulemaking. So that is perhaps not the ideal. Okay. The other side of the coin is, to what extent does scheduling shape union organizing in this moment when we're seeing a lot of union organizing? And this is a really interesting point, because on the one hand, it is perhaps exactly the kind of stressor and manifestation of what can be felt like as unfair and dehumanizing treatment that might spur workers to organize and have collective voice. On the other hand, unstable scheduling makes it really hard to build solidarity, because you are not necessarily working with the same people in regular time periods and having that kind of repeated exposure that can build trust and feelings of collective consciousness. Hannah Shepard, a sociologist at Rutgers, actually has a really nice paper looking at how work scheduling is associated with those kind of social network ties that might lead to union organizing. That said, schedules are on people's minds when they are organizing at Starbucks, for sure, and as Pia mentioned at the top, at other places as well. And so that's one thing we are looking at in the Shift project is support for unionization as a function of job quality characteristics like scheduling practices.
You are muted, Pierre.
Sorry. Okay. Julie, Peter, did y'all have anything to add to that? Okay. We are nearing the end of our time, so why don't I ask the three of you if you have any comments that you'd like to make as we wrap this up. Daniel, why don't we start with you? Go in the order we started with.
Great. Well, no, I really appreciate the chance to join with you all and talk about these issues. And it's really cool to see people bringing to bear, interesting data sources on these questions. It's been, I think, a real constraint on why we haven't had more research on scheduling. And it's always it's an ongoing process to find new sources of data that can shed new light. And so it's great to see Julie creatively using the CPS and Peter with the payroll data, and I'm sure more such things to come. Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, thanks for including me. It's great to be part of this and to see all the questions that were on your mind. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but feel free to send me an email after if you want to follow up.
Yeah, it's Sam here. I just want to say thanks all for coming. And it's great to see some people in this community and keep pushing forward on this field.
Okay, well, thank you all.
One last thing I would mention, the child tax credit. And I would really say, like, that type of policy, the timing matters in terms of payment delivery. And we should really think about how the social benefit program could be restructured in some way to help smooth that frequent instability. That's it.
Thank you all. Remember to check out Julie's paper on the INET website, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.